Hello. Today, we will be talking about the key mathematical notations that is required for economic students at the university level. The question might be, why mathematics? We need math in economics. Mathematical economics is a method of economics that utilizes math principle and the tools to create economic theories and to investigate economic quandaries. Mathematics permits economists to construct precisely defined models from which exact conclusion can be derived with the mathematical logic, which can then be tested using statistical data and used to make a quantifiable prediction about future economic activities. The marriage of statistical methods and mathematics and economic principle enabled the development of econometrics, advancement in the computing power, which is the big data techniques, and other advanced mathematical application have played a large part in making quantitative method as standard elements of economics. So mathematical economics is a form of economics that relies on quantitative method to describe economic phenomena. Although the discipline of economics is heavily influenced by the bias of the researcher, and mathematics allow economists to precisely define and test economic theories against real-world data, and also economic policies decisions are rarely made without any mathematical model to assess their impact, and new economic papers, as you can see, research papers are rarely published without some mathematics in them. So once students know economics and then they know math, the student would develop a basic understanding of economic principle, which allows for an encouraged informed decision of a media covered issue. And these topics include contrasting macroeconomics and microeconomics, gross domestic product, which is the GDP, economic growth and a business cycle, unemployment and inflation, aggregate supply and demand, scarcity, opportunity cost and trade, law of supply and demand, accounting versus economic profits, money and exchange rates, government choices, market efficiency and equity, monopoly and competition, externalities, public goods and free riders, and globalization and trade policy. So these are some of the concepts that you will be dealing with if you're studying economics, but for most of these, you need a math. So let's go through some of the key mathematical notation. In economics, we are often concerned with the relationship between two or more variables. And the coordinate system is that ordered pair of number can be graphed on a two-dimensional grid. If you see this graph, we have x-axis and we have y-axis. And also we have 0, which is the origin. By looking at this dot that we have right here, you can select any dot anywhere. But just for the sake of simplicity, I choose this dot. The first number in the order pair is the x coordinate and tells us the horizontal location of this point. It tells us the horizontal location of this point. The second number in the order pair is the y coordinate, which is the y coordinate. These are the y coordinate. And it tells us the vertical location of the point. If you see this number, the point that we have here, it corresponds to x is equal 3 and y is equal 2. It can be written in mathematical form as x and y, that is equal to 3 and 2. So the point with both x coordinate and y coordinate of 0 is called origin. Now, curve in the coordinate system, and that in economics we often want to show how one variable affects another, holding all other variables constant. And this will bring us to the issue of coordination, or correlation. Sorry, this will bring us to the issue of correlation. Correlation is statistics that measures the degree to which two variables move in a relation to each other. If we look at through finance perspective, in finance, the correlation can measure the movement of stock with that of a benchmark index, such as S&P 500. Also, correlation measures association, but note that it does not show if X causes Y or vice versa, or if the association is caused by a third factor. That does not show this one. It just measures the association, but it doesn't tell us whether Y causes X to increase or X causes Y to increase, or there is a third factor that will tell us that it causes the whole movement in those curves. So what we have now is for instance, we have Y and X. If X represents our studying for a test, this is ours studying for the test, and Y is a test score we say that there is a positive relationship. This is called positive relationship or positive slope. So we call this a positive slope. So what does that tell us? That tells us that the more hour you study for that particular test or exam, the higher is your score. Means there's a positive relationship. The more you put an emphasis on X, the higher Y would be. And also we have two variables that moves in an opposite direction, and we call this negative slope. An example we can say is the demand curve. If the quantity of good consumed wants to be purchased, X varies as its price varies. So this shows that how quantity of good a consumer wants to purchase, which is X, this is the quantity that they want, the consumer wants to purchase, a price P. So this negative relationship says that how the quantity of good a consumer wants to purchase varies as its price varies by y. So there's a negative relationship. If the price goes down, a consumption goes up. If the price goes up, consumption goes down. If the price goes down, consumption goes up. Means that there is a negative relationship. One goes up, the other goes down. Now, this brings us to the issue, as we already mentioned, the issue of slope. So the concept of slope is important in economics because it is used to measure the rate at which changes are taking place. And economists often look at how things change and about how one item changes in response to changes in another item. So it may show, for example, how demand changes when price changes, or how consumption changes when income changes, or how quickly sales are growing. So slope, again, it measures the rate of change in a dependent variable as the independent variable changes. The greater the slope, the steeper the line. And then let's say use an example. We have a linear function. A linear function y is equal to a plus b times x. B is the slope of the line. And again, slope means that a unit change in x, the independent variable, will result in a changes in y by the amount of b. And this can be written as slope is equal to changes in y divided by changes in x, or this is equal to rise over run. So slope shows both steepnesses and direction. With a positive slope, the line moves upward when going from left to right. With the negative slopes, the line moves downward when going from left to right. So if the two linear functions have the same slope, then they call a parallel. So let's now use some of these examples. As we said before, I'm going to draw for the sake of repetition. As we say, if you have a curve like this, this means that it is a positive. It's a positive slope. Again, positive slope. We use an example. X is number of hours you study for the exam. Y is the score. There's a positive. More study, higher grade. Then we have an example of a slope of line looks like this. And we have y and x. Again, this is called a negative slope. And we say the price and consumption. There is a negative relationship. Y is the price of good. If y goes up, x goes down. If y goes down, x goes up. Means that it's an opposite of one another. And also we have a infinite slope. I guess there is one I, infinite slope, and also we have zero slope. And also we mentioned that we have y and x, and we have parallel slopes. So we're gonna go through all of these. Just a parallel slope is that we have two lines. These two lines, they are parallel, but their slopes are equal. And the only thing is that they have a different intercepts. Their intercept is different, but their slope is the same. So if we look at here, we say negative. This is a typical downward sloping. And it's a demand curve which says that the demand declines, again, as we say, as price increases, and vice versa. And also for the zero slope, as we say, this is a special case of horizontal demand curve, which says that at any price above P, if that's the P star, say that any price above P star, demand drops to zero. An example we can use might be a competitor's product, which is considered just as good. And last not least is the infinite slope. Again, this is also a special case of a vertical demand curve, which says that regardless of a price quantity, demanded is the same. This is a special case of vertical demand curve, which says that regardless of the price, quantity demanded is the same. Doesn't matter what happened, demand remains the same, even though if the price changes or not. An example might be a medicine. As long as medication, as long as the price does not exceed what the consumer can afford, then demand will not change. So same thing we can say about, again, as I mentioned, the parallel slopes. Again, the slope of the two lines are the same, just the intercept is different. And also, we can also talk about the supply might be represented by a linear supply function, such as we have is Q times S is equal A plus B times P. Again, here, this represents supply. And then also P is the price. So economists might consider how sensitive supply is to changes in prices. Again, we can use a graph where we say that we have the price times a quantity. And if that's the slope, then this is a typical upward sloping supply curve, which says that the supply rises as price rises. So as price goes up, then the supply will go up as well. So there's a positive relationship. We may want to ask a question like how strongly consumer reacts if the price of product changes. And that brings us to the issue of a demand curve. So if the demand curve is very steep, that brings us the shape of again, if you want to ask the question, how strongly consumers? So how strongly consumers react if the price changes, the price of a good changes. Now, this has come to the issue of a steepness and flat curve. So if we look at this graph, then we see it's a steep demand curve. So what the steep demand curve telling us is that if the demand curve is very steep, like this, quantity desire does not change much in response to a change in prices. Simply by just calculating the slope, it would tell you that the changes are very small. By looking at the slope of the line, you can tell that whether the changes are great or not by the shape of that or the location of the steepnesses of that particular curve. So if it's a steep, means the desire does not change much in response to a change in prices. So that means that if prices change, if that's the shape of the curve, then that means that if the price changes, then the demand doesn't change very much. For instance, you can say in terms of gasoline, it's a necessity. If gas you were buying, doesn't matter how it changes, how much it changes. But if it's in cold weather like Canada, people must drive. Therefore, the demand doesn't change even though if the price changes. And this is just simply, I'm talking about just to elaborate on it so that you can get the point. Now, if the demand is, if the curve is flat, as we say, is a flat demand curve, then this telling us that if the demand curve is very flat, quantity desire changes as great deal when the price changes. Again, if you look at the slope, look at the slope of this. So these are the changes. So we can see that this one is greater. So if that is the shape of your curve, then you can say that when the price changes, then the demand will be affected greatly. So that's the concept that we want. So in general, we can say that the slope of a line is a ratio of a vertical distance covered to the horizontal distance covered as we move along the line. So we can say that the slope of the line is the ratio of the vertical distance covered to the horizontal distance, which is this one, cover this one and then this one, as we move along the line, And this can be simply written as slope is a change in area covered, vertical distance area covered, by changes in horizontal distance, which is covered, or changes in y over changes in x, and then also this can be written as slope is equal to rise over run. So I'm not trying to insult your intelligence, I'm just trying to explain to see if we understand this concept really well. I tend to repeat myself many times, is just because I'm trying to explain the concept so that repetition probably remember if I repeat something more than once. Now, this brings us to the definition of microeconomics and macroeconomics. So microeconomics is the study of how households and firms make decisions and how they interact in the market. Very simple. Microeconomics is the study of how households and firms make decisions and how they interact in the market. On the other hand, macroeconomics is the study of economic-wide phenomena. And that includes the inflation and employment and also economic growth, which is the business cycle. So we can say that this is a study of aggregate economy. So we have covered this. Now let's talk about the economy's income and expenditure. So we can talk about the economies of income and expenditure. To judge whether or not an economy is doing well, it is useful to look at a gross domestic product, and that is GDP, gross domestic product. What is GDP telling us? GDP measures the total income of everyone in the economy. And also, GDP measures the total expenditure on economy's output of goods and services. For an economy as a whole, total income must be equal to total expenditure. And the example of this can be if it costs you to pay someone to cut your lawn, the expenditure on the lawn service is $100, and it's exactly equal to the income earned from the production of the lawn services, which is $100. So expenditure is equal to the income. Total income equals total expenditure. We can also use the circular flow diagram to show why total income and total expenditure must be equal. This is a very nice diagram. I liked it. I took it from the textbook, which I really like it. And this is very simple to understand, and then it explains. In this diagram, the central point is the GDP, which is the measures of both aggregate production and aggregate income generated within a nation during a given period of time. So the circular flow diagram demonstrates this by illustrating that production generates income, which in turn results in a purchasing power that generates the demand for a product in the market. So we have a household, we have the market, and we have the firms. So what will happen is that household buys goods and services. They spend from the firms. They're buying it from the firms. And firms uses their revenue from sales to pay wages to workers, rent to landlords, and a profit to the firm owner. In the simple economy described by this circular flow diagram, calculating GDP could be done by adding up the total purchase of household or summing total income paid by firms. However, this simple diagram is somewhat unrealistic. A reason is because it omits saving, taxes, government purchases, and investment purchases by firms. However, regardless, each transaction always have buyer and seller. Therefore, total expenditure in the economy must be equal to the total income. So again, the household buys their goods from firms, and firm uses their revenue. They're buying it here, and the firm uses their revenue to pay from the sale to pay for the wages to workers, and rent to landowners, and profit to the firms. So it's a very nice diagram, and I hope that you understand this diagrams. Now, markets and competition. What is market? Market, in a very short, is a group of buyer and seller of a particular goods or services. This is a place where the buyers and the sellers get together to conduct an transaction. And now, in terms of a demand, we have a demand curve, and a demand curve is the relationship between the price and a quantity demanded. So this demand curve is the relationship between price and quantity demanded. Now, what is quantity demanded? Quantity demanded is the amount of goods that buyers are willing to purchase. This is the amount of goods the consumer or buyers are willing to purchase. And one important determinant of the quantity demanded is the price of the product. Quantity demanded is negatively related to the price. And this implies that the demand curve is downward sloping. And this brings us to the law of a demand. So what's the law of demand? The law of demand claims that other things equal, the quantity demanded of good falls when the price of good rises. So this claims that other things equal, the quantity demanded of a good falls. Usually I put an arrow down when the price of the good rises. Usually I put arrow up. And this brings us to something really important where we have to understand what is the demand schedule. The demand schedule is a table that shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. The quantity demanded. You see the price, and that's the quantity demanded. So demand schedule is simply a table which shows the relationship between the price of good and the quantity demanded. And demand curve, on the other hand, demand curve is a graph of a relationship, a graph of a relationship. So this is a graph of the relationship between, so I'll just go between the price of good and the quantity demanded. So price is generally drawn on the vertical axis. So price is usually here, which is the vertical axis. Vertical axis. And quantity demanded is represented on a x-axis. That is equal to quantity. And on a vertical axis, that is equal to price. And you can say that this shows the relationship. This is the price, and this is the quantity demanded. At this price, this much quantity is demanded. At this price, at $2, at $1.50, $1, $2, and these corresponds to the quantities demanded at that particular price. So that shows the relationship. Now, shifting a demand curve, the demand curve shows how much consumer wants to buy at any price, holding constant many other factors that influence buying decisions. Namely, we can say is the income, price of related good. So the price of the related good, and tastes, expectation, and also number of buyers. These are few. If any of these other factors changes, the demand curve will shift. An increase in demand can be represented by a shift of a demand curve to the right, and a decrease in a demand curve can be represented by a shift of a demand curve to the left. So this now brings us to the issues of supply. So supply curve is the relationship. The supply curve is the relationship. Between price and the quantity supplied. So supply curve and demand curve was a relationship between the price and quantity demanded, but supply curve, it's simple. Just by looking at the word itself, you can say that describes the relationship between price and the quantity supplied. And this brings us to the issue of quantity supplied. What is quantity supplied? Quantity supplied is the amount of a good that seller in the previous market, the quantity supplied, quantity demanded was the amount of good that a buyer willing to purchase. But here quantity supplied is the amount of a good that a seller are willing and able to sell. So quantity supplied is positively related to price. The lower the price, then the greater the price, the greater the supply. So what law of supply states? Law of supply claims, the law of supply claims that other things equal, other things equal, the quantity supplied of a good rises when the price of the good rises. Again, we can talk about supply schedule. Here, again, supply schedule is the table. It's the table that shows a relationship, the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied. Quantity supplied. Again, this is simply just a table that it shows the relationship at how much of this quantity of good will be supplied to the market at this price, and then how much will be supplied in this price, and also in this price, in this price, in this price, in this price, and also so forth and so on. But now a supply curve is again that supply curve is a graph of a relationship. This is again a graph of the relation. It's a graph of a relationship between the price of a good and the quantity supplied. And again, as we say, at 0.50, at 0 there is nothing. According to the schedule, if you look at here, at 0 there was nothing, at 50 there was nothing. You see that 50 cents there will be 0 supply, but at $1, this much will be supplied. At 150, this much will be supplied. At $2, this much will be supplied. At the price of good is $2. This much will be supplied, and so forth and so on at 250, and that's $3, which is right here. So that's the graph. Supply curve is the graph of that particular good. Now, last not least, we can now talk about the shifts in the supply curve, and then that brings us to supply and demand together. Shift in the supply curve is that the supply curve shows how much producers offer for sale at any given price, holding constant all other factors that may influence producers' decision about how much to sell. For instance, input prices, especially oil in the macro context, and also we have a technology expectation and also number of sellers in the market. When any of these other factors changes, the supply curves will shift. An increase in the supply can be represented by a shift of a supply curve to the right, and a decrease in a supply curve be represented by a shift of supply curve to the left. Now, supply and a demand, if we put it together. Again, this graph, I took it from the textbook. It's Mankiwi. It's a really nice one, and I really like it. It's just for the purpose of teaching and helping students. Let's talk about equilibrium. The point where the supply and demand curve intersects, it is called the market equilibrium. If we see, this is our supply and this is our demand curve. Where supply and demand meet or intersects, we're saying that supply is equal demand. And this is we called markets equilibrium. It represents the situation in which the price has reached the level. It represents the situation in which the price has reached the level where quantity supplied equal quantity demanded. And this brings us to the issue of equilibrium. Price, the price that balances quantity supplied and quantity demanded. The equilibrium price is often called the market clearing price because both buyers and sellers are satisfied at this price. So this is also called market clearing price because at this point, like this much supply at this price, both the supplier and the consumer, they are both happy. So they are both happy, and therefore equilibrium quantity is the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded at the equilibrium price. So if the actual market price is higher than the equilibrium price, there will be a surplus of a good. So let's say we have actual in the market price is higher than the equilibrium price, there will be a surplus of a goods. What is surplus? Surplus is a situation in which quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. So quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. And also we have a deficit, or you can call it a shortage, is a situation in which quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied. Here, quantity actually demanded is greater than quantity supplied. So if the actual price is lower than the equilibrium price, there will be a shortage of goods. And then we can draw this one in a graph, and I don't have space here, so let's use this place. So let's draw our supply and demand. So if we have a supply, and then we have a demand, and let's say this is our equilibrium, that is Q star, and that is P stars, and that's P, and that's our quantity. Then if the price is, let's say, the equilibrium price is, let's say it's $2. And then if the price is $2.50 here, if it's $2, then we have surplus. But if the actual price is lower than equilibrium price, let's say here at 150, then we have a shortage. So again, we said we have a surplus and also we have a deficit. So a surplus is a situation in which the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. To eliminate the surplus, producers will lower the prices until the market reaches equilibrium or market clearing condition. And also if we have a shortage, and a shortage which is a deficit is a situation in which equilibrium demanded is greater than quantity supply. If the actual price is lower than the equilibrium price, there will be a shortage of that good. So what producer would do is the producer will respond to the shortage by raising the price of the goods until the market reaches equilibrium. So in either case, if you have surplus, then in surplus, the producer will have to lower the prices until the price reaches here. And then they have to lower the price. But then if it's the price is here, then there will be a shortage in the market. And then the producer have to increase the prices until we reaches here. So this brings us to the end of our tutorial for today. And I hope that this will help. And please subscribe to the channel if you can, and also wait for other videos that shortly will be uploaded. Again, thank you so much.